Story 1. The stove that was still warm. I'd been hiking since first light, cutting across a section of the ridge that didn't show up on any of the newer maps. The older survey lines were still burned into my memory, and I knew a few shortcuts that could shave hours off the route if you were willing to deal with overgrowth and unstable ground. By mid-afternoon, the clouds were hanging low, and the wind had that sharp, damp smell that meant rain wasn't far off. I figured I had maybe another mile before I'd hit the main trail again. That's when I saw it, half hidden in a break between two black pines, a shape that didn't belong to the forest. It was a cabin, small, square, its weathered boards grayed almost to silver. There was no sign of a path leading to it, no ruts, no worn trail, not even deer tracks in the damp leaves. I might have passed it by if not for the faint curl of smoke rising from the rusted stovepipe, thin as thread against the grey sky. It was the wrong kind of day for smoke to hang that way. The air was moving enough that it should have dispersed. That little detail hooked into me, and before I knew it, I was stepping off the ridge and into the clearing. Up close, the place looked abandoned. Moss climbed high on the walls, and the porch sagged under my weight. I knocked, more out of habit than expectation. The sound was dull, swallowed quick by the trees. No answer. The door swung inward with a slow, stubborn creak, and the smell of wood smoke and damp wool met me like an old coat being thrown over my shoulders. Inside, the air was still, heavy. Dust lay over everything in a thick, undisturbed layer, except for the stove in the corner. The old cast iron was warm when I laid my hand on it. Not lukewarm, not sun-warmed, truly warm, like it had been burning within the last hour. Beside it sat a chipped enamel mug, half full of something that steamed faintly. The steam rose in thin, deliberate curls, as if the liquid wasn't cooling at all. I told myself it was leftover heat, nothing more. But the hairs on my arms disagreed. The bed in the corner drew my eye. The quilt was faded but clean, and the mattress held a deep, unmistakable dent. Like someone had been lying there moments ago. The sheet was still stretched tight at the far corner, but the pillow had the faintest impression of a head. I looked to the floor for signs of whoever had been there. Only one boot print, fresh, sharp-edged in the dust, led from the bed toward the stove, and then it stopped. No turn, no smudge, no fade into nothing. Just ended. I called out again, my voice too loud in that close space. The sound died against the walls. They creaked softly, not like settling timber, but like the slow intake of a breath. My pack felt suddenly heavier. I told myself I'd just leave, get back to the ridge, pretend I'd never seen this place. But I didn't move. I don't know how long I stood there, watching the slow pulse of the steam from the mug, listening to the quiet shift of the boards under my boots. When I finally stepped outside, the air felt thinner, colder. The smoke from the stovepipe was gone, the metal now a dull, lifeless red. I checked the sky, gauging daylight, and headed downslope. The forest felt different, quieter, though the wind still moved the treetops. I pushed on, not daring to glance back. Halfway down the ridge, I stopped for breath and looked toward where I thought the clearing might be. Between the trees, I saw it again, the same thin column of smoke, drifting upward, weaker now, like a hand waving from far away. I don't know if it was a trick of the wind or my own imagination, but I felt, with absolute certainty, that if I turned back, the door would already be open and something would be waiting just inside. Would you like me to now expand this to a richer, more layered 1,500-word version that keeps this same pacing but adds more sensory detail and build-up? Story 2. The chair facing the door. It was one of those days where the trail seemed to pull you farther than you'd planned. The air was heavy with the smell of wet leaves, and the light filtering through the pines had that dull, late autumn gold to it. The kind that makes you lose track of time. I'd been walking since morning, keeping an easy pace, no real destination, just covering ground to quiet my mind. Somewhere past the second ridge, I saw it. A warped, weather-bleached sign nailed crooked to a tulip poplar, the word lodge barely visible under peeling red paint. No arrow, no mileage, just the word. I might have ignored it, but there was something about how the wood had split, how the letters were almost being swallowed back into the grain, like the forest was reclaiming the memory of whatever it pointed to. Without thinking much on it, I took the narrow path that branched off to the right. The turnoff was overgrown, just wide enough for a deer trail, and I had to duck under low branches slick with drizzle. Every 20 yards or so, I catch a glimpse of something ahead. Roofline, maybe, but it vanished between the trees before I could focus. The ground dipped slightly, and after another 10 minutes, the forest opened into a small clearing. There it was. The cabin looked like it had been set down hard and left to sink into the soil. The back half was swallowed in a rise of earth and roots, as if the hill behind it had crept forward over the years. The windows were coated in grime so thick they looked painted over. The porch leaned, its railing half collapsed, the boards dark with rot. I stepped onto the porch and felt the give under my boots. The front door hung crooked on its hinges but was still shut. I put a hand on it, and the wood felt soft, almost spongy, from years of rain. When I pushed it open, the hinges gave a long, tired groan. Inside, the smell hit me first. Dry rot, stale air, and something faintly metallic beneath it, like old nails in a damp jar. The room was bare except for one thing, a single wooden chair in the exact center of the floor, facing the front door. It wasn't just placed there, it felt set. No dust on the seat, no cobwebs on the legs, though the rest of the floor was coated in a fine, undisturbed layer of grey. I stepped closer and noticed the boards underneath were worn smooth in 2 half-moon arcs, as if someone had been rocking the chair back and forth for years. Not fast rocking either, slow, methodical, enough to etch the pattern deep into the wood. I reached out and touched the backrest. The varnish was long gone, the surface dry and splintered, but there was a faint warmth in the wood that didn't match the chill in the room. I don't know why, but I felt the need to look behind it, to convince myself there wasn't anything there. The wall behind the chair was bare, the same grey-brown planks as the rest. When I straightened up, something in the angle of the room felt wrong. I looked back at the doorway and saw that the chair was no longer aligned perfectly with it, just slightly off, maybe an inch or two, like it had turned to look at me. My throat went dry, but I told myself I'd misremembered the way it had been set when I walked in. I backed toward the door, watching it the whole way. By the time I reached the porch, my hands were cold despite the damp heat of the air. I stepped out and let the door swing closed on its own, the sound sharp in the stillness. I took a few steps down the path before the hair on my neck prickled so hard it almost hurt. I turned. Through the grime-coated window, I could just make out the faintest shape, a figure sitting in the chair. It was still, but the posture was unmistakable. The glass should have been too cloudy to see through from either side, and yet, in that moment, I could see it as clearly as if there were no barrier at all. A pale outline, shoulders hunched slightly forward, head tilted, watching. I told myself to move, to put distance between me and that place. But as I turned back to the trail, I heard it, the slow, drawn-out creak of wood under a shifting weight. Not the quick rhythm of footsteps or the sudden snap of a board, just that single, deliberate shift, like someone leaning forward in their seat to get a better look. I didn't glance back again. I walked until the sound of my own breathing drowned out everything else, until the path rejoined the main trail, until the air felt open again. Still, even now, when I think about that window, I can't decide what unsettles me more. The thought that the figure might have been there all along, waiting, or the thought that it hadn't been there until I turned my back. Story 3. The Cabin with No Inside. I was cutting across the lower ridge late that afternoon, trying to beat the rain I could feel building behind the mountains. The main trail dipped toward the creek, but I decided to take the old service road instead. Just a pale scar in the weeds now, leading straight through a stand of poplar and into an open patch I'd never noticed before. That's when I saw it. The cabin stood at the far edge of the clearing, framed neat against the trees. It wasn't leaning or sunken like most out here. Straight walls, a whole roof, the kind of symmetry you only see when something's been kept up, or at least built to last. The boards were weathered, sure, but not warped. The front porch stretched the length of the place, and in the center a swing hung from 2 thick chains. Even from where I stood, it looked steady enough to hold weight. I approached slow, half expecting signs of recent use. Boot tracks in the dirt, a stack of split wood, something. But there was nothing. The grass at the porch's edge was high and brittle, seed heads bowing with the weight of last night's dew. When I stepped onto the boards, they didn't even groan under me. The door was solid, the handle cold under my palm. I pushed once, then harder, leaning my shoulder into it. It didn't budge. Not locked, just unmoving, like it had been fitted into the frame and then sealed there. The windows were what unsettled me most. Up close, the glass wasn't cloudy or dusted over. It was just black. Not a deep tint, not shade from the trees. Black like ink, flat and absolute. I couldn't see my own reflection in it, not even the faint glint of sky. It was like looking into a painted square nailed to the wall. I circled around, hoping for a back door or a loose shutter. On the far side, a section of lower siding had rotted through, the boards soft and splintering. I pulled at one until it came away in my hand, then aimed a boot at the gap. My foot struck through and hit nothing, not floor, not joist, not debris, just open space. I crouched and peered in. The light from outside stopped dead at the threshold. Inside, there were no walls, no floor, only emptiness. Not dark in the way of shadow, where your eyes slowly adjust, but dark like depth that doesn't end. I shined my flashlight through, and the beam cut maybe a foot before it dulled, swallowed like a match flame in fog. My chest tightened in a way I can't explain, a pressure that told me I wasn't meant to be looking. I backed away without taking my eyes off the hole. The air around me was still, no wind, no birds. The swing on the front porch gave a long, drawn-out creak. I froze. It wasn't the kind of creak you get from wood settling. It was the rhythm of something in motion. But the air hadn't shifted, and the chains were perfectly still when I rounded back to the front. I told myself I'd imagined it, the sound carrying from somewhere else in the woods. But when I stepped off the porch and crossed the clearing, I glanced back one last time. The swing was angled now, just slightly, like it had been pushed and left mid-arc. I didn't go back to that ridge for the rest of the season. But sometimes, when I take the main trail along the creek, I get the strange sense that if I were to glance uphill through the break in the poplars, I'd see that porch again, and the swing wouldn't be still. Story 4. The Lantern in the Loft. I'd been following the old game trail most of the afternoon, the kind you find when the woods open just enough to show where deer still travel, even if no one else does. The day had been quiet, the air still damp from rain the night before, and I was starting to think I'd misjudged the time. The ridge ahead would put me back on familiar ground, but the light was going fast. dropping into that grey in-between hour when the forest begins to feel like it's holding its breath. I'd just stepped over a tangle of roots when I saw it through the trees. A cabin perched at an angle over a narrow creek bed. It wasn't large, maybe 10 feet wide, with a steep roof and a loft that jutted just enough to cast the lower floor in shadow. The siding was silver grey, boards warped from years of weather, but the shape of it held together better than most abandoned places I'd come across. It looked like it had been built to last, and in its way, it had. I moved closer, boots slipping slightly on the damp slope. The creek below was no more than a trickle, whispering under a thin scatter of stones. The ladder leading up to the loft hung crooked, 2 rungs missing entirely, the rest dark and soft with rot. I was thinking I'd just give the place a glance and move on when I noticed it, faint but steady. A glow in the loft window, an oil lantern. It didn't make sense. There were no footprints in the mud around the cabin, no fresh cuts in the woodpile beside it. And yet, that warm, amber light pulsed gently against the glass, casting just enough to make the shadow of the loft rail stretch over the creek like a drawn line. I called up, my voice low but carrying in the stillness. "Anyone up there?" For a long moment, nothing. Then, the slow creak of wood from above, as if someone had shifted their weight. The lantern swayed slightly, and for a heartbeat, I could have sworn the shadows it cast didn't belong to the rail or the roofline. They were the wrong shapes, narrower, with a kind of bend that suggested limbs where there shouldn't be any. I felt the urge to climb up, to see for myself. But the ladder wouldn't hold my weight. I backed away, telling myself I'd mark the spot and come back with another hiker in the morning. As I turned, the creak came again, slower this time, deliberate. It didn't sound like footsteps, more like something leaning forward to watch me go. The next morning, I found a friend willing to follow me back. The light was good, the sun sharp enough to cut through the trees, but when we reached the spot, there was no cabin, no structure at all. The slope where it had stood was nothing but a hollow in the earth, its edges damp and soft, filled with still water that reflected the sky in a flat, unbroken sheet. We circled, thinking maybe we'd lost the exact place, but there was no sign of fresh collapse, no scattered boards or rusted nails, just that dark water and the faint ripple where the creek fed into it. My friend laughed it off, but I felt a cold weight settle in my chest that didn't lift on the hike back. That night, I lay in my tent, the wind barely moving the fabric. I must have drifted close to sleep when I saw it. A faint, swaying light moving above me. At first, I thought it was the moon caught in the branches, but the glow was warmer, shifting in a way no moonlight ever could. I didn't move, barely breathed, as it rocked gently side to side, casting shadows across the tent that bent and reached just like they had in the loft. When I finally worked up the courage to unzip the flap, there was nothing there. Just darkness and the faint, steady trickle of the creek in the distance. But all night I could swear I heard the soft creak of wood, slow and patient, somewhere just out of sight. Story 5. The mirror nailed to the tree. It was late October, and the air had that brittle, hollow feel that makes every sound carry farther than it should. I'd been following an old, washed-out trail through a patch of forest that hardly saw hikers anymore. The ground was littered with wet leaves that clung to my boots, and the smell of rot was heavy in the air. About half a mile past the ridgeline, I spotted it. A small, weather-beaten cabin tucked against a rise. Its roof canted just enough to suggest years of neglect. The door was chained shut with a length of rusted logging chain, the kind you'd use to bind something heavy. I might have walked past it, if not for what stood just off to the right, nailed high into the trunk of a massive oak. It was a mirror, maybe 3 feet tall, with a cracked, gold-trimmed frame. The glass was spotted in places, but not so much that it hid the reflection. I stepped closer, expecting to see the cabin behind me. Instead, the glass showed another cabin entirely, a larger one in better condition, with yellow light spilling warmly from its windows. My first thought was that it had to be some kind of trick, a pane of glass angled to catch another building deeper in the woods. But the oak faced nothing but shadow and trees. I stood there a long time, watching. In the mirror's glow, faint figures moved inside the other cabin, indistinct at first, just the suggestion of shapes behind the glass. Then one stopped, turned. Its head tilted in a way that made my chest tighten. Slowly, it began walking toward where the inside of the other cabin's wall should have been, but in the mirror, the figure didn't vanish when it should have. It kept coming, straight toward the edge of the glass. I stepped back without thinking, my boots crunching leaves. The figure's reflection stepped out of view, though the edge of the mirror was still right there in front of me. There was nowhere for it to go, no corner to turn, no hallway to vanish into. My breath felt tight in my throat, and for a moment I was sure I'd see it emerge from behind me in the real world. But when I spun around, there was only the chained cabin and the quiet trees. When I looked back, the mirror was different. No glowing windows, no figures, just my own pale face staring back, eyes wide and unsure. The gold trim seemed more tarnished now, the cracks in the glass deeper, like they'd spread in the few seconds I'd turned away. I left in a hurry, telling myself it was just an odd trick of reflection and nerves, but the forest felt heavier on the walk back, the air still and close. And every so often in the corner of my vision, I thought I caught a warm yellow glow between the trees, gone each time I turned my head. That night, when I closed my eyes, I dreamed of standing in front of that mirror again. Only this time, there was no reflection of me at all, just the larger cabin. Every window filled with light, and all the figures inside standing still, their faces turned toward where I should have been. Story 6. The typewriter that wouldn't stop the snow had started earlier than the forecast said it would, fine and dry at first, then heavy enough to smother the sound of my own boots. I'd been cutting through a narrow stretch of ridge trail, trying to make the old fire road before it got bad, but somewhere past the half-mile mark, I realized I'd taken the wrong spur. The path dipped into a pocket of evergreens where the wind dropped away, and that's when I saw it. A cabin, or what was left of one, slouched under the weight of years and weather. Most of the roof had caved in, but the front corner still stood straight enough to suggest shelter. I pushed inside through a gap where the door had rotted off. The air was still. Cold in a way that felt separate from the storm outside, like the place had been holding its breath for a long time. Snow dusted the floor under the breaks in the roof, but in the far corner, bone dry, as if the weather hadn't touched it, stood a warped desk. On it sat a typewriter, the old manual kind, green paint worn to the metal at the edges. The keys were moving, not rattling in the wind, moving in slow, deliberate strokes, each one pressing down, then lifting, with the crisp, mechanical snap of metal on paper. Loose sheets were scattered across the floor around it, all typed with the same line, over and over. Don't turn around. The words filled the pages completely, single-spaced, as if someone had been at it for hours. I told myself it had to be a trick, wind through the rafters, maybe a spring inside the machine let loose. I stepped closer, watching the arms rise and fall. The rhythm wasn't random. It had a strange kind of patience to it, like the machine was waiting for me to notice something. I picked up one of the pages. The ink was fresh, still wet enough to smudge at the edges. That did something to my stomach I didn't like. I glanced toward the gaps in the walls, looking for fishing line or some hidden motor. Nothing. The paper in the roller was nearly full, the same warning typed down to the last few lines. Don't turn around. Don't turn around. Don't turn. The next word didn't come. The key hung in the air like it was hesitating. I told myself I'd just look. Just a quick glance over my shoulder to prove the place was empty. But I didn't move. My eyes stayed on the typewriter, on the way the carriage slid back with a slow clack, starting a fresh line. The first word came through, letter by letter, crisp and black. My own name. It typed it once, then again. The sound impossibly loud in that small space. I stepped back, heart hammering, the floorboards under me shifting with a muted groan. The typewriter didn't stop. My name filled the page, the keys striking faster now, the carriage slamming back and forth. It was almost like breathing. Sharp inhale, quick exhale, over and over until the page was pulled free and dropped to the desk. Another blank sheet slid into place without my touching it. The storm outside had gone muffled, or maybe I'd just stopped hearing it. I couldn't tell how long I stood there, staring at that machine, waiting for it to do something else. The snow in the roof gaps had stopped falling, but the air inside the cabin felt colder, tighter. I backed toward the doorway, my boots catching on the littered pages. My name followed me, striking out in steady rhythm behind me until the trees swallowed the sound. By the time I made it back to the fire road, the snow was knee-deep and the light was gone. I never went back to that ridge. But a month later, a plain envelope showed up in my mailbox. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper, creased once down the middle. My name filled it, line after line, in the exact same ink. The bottom line stopped halfway through, like the key had paused, waiting. Story 7, The Bed Made for a Child. It was one of those damp autumn afternoons when the light never fully commits to being day, when the clouds hang low enough to make you feel like you're walking under a lid. I'd been moving through a stretch of pine forest I didn't know well, trying to cross a slope before the weather broke again. The ground was soft from the rain earlier that morning, spongy in places, and the air smelled of sap and wet needles. That's when I saw it. Just a sliver of a shape through the trees, the corner of something straight and human-made where there shouldn't have been anything. The cabin sat half-sunk into the hill, as if the slope had been slowly swallowing it for decades. Its roofline dipped toward the ground, and one whole wall was nearly buried in dirt and pine duff. The door hung open, moving slightly with the push of the breeze. No path led to it, no cut logs, no old trash heap, none of the usual signs that someone had lived here and left. Inside, the air was stale and close, though the open doorway let in enough of the outside to keep it from feeling entirely dead. The place was one room, bare walls, no stove or table, nothing to suggest real living. Except for the bed. It was small, too small for an adult, and sat in the far corner where the shadows settled deepest. The quilt on it was faded but clean, tucked with the kind of precision that doesn't come from habit so much as intention. On top of the quilt, dead center, sat a folded paper crane. The paper was damp, the edges curling from the humidity, but the folds were sharp and careful, as if whoever made it had taken their time. I picked it up without thinking, and that's when I noticed. The pillow underneath was warm. Not sun-warmed, not the lingering heat of a room shut tight, but warm in the way of someone having just been there. The rain had left the earth outside soft enough that every step I'd taken to get here had left a deep print. But when I stepped back to the doorway, I saw no other footprints. The slope around the cabin was untouched, not even the small depressions deer or raccoons might leave. I told myself it was nothing, that whoever had been here came and went some other way, maybe over the buried side, but that warm pillow kept pressing against my thoughts. I stepped out into the damp air, intending to put distance between me and the place. The pines muffled the sound of the wind, but not enough to hide what came next. As I pushed the door shut behind me, I heard it from inside. Slow, steady breathing. Not labored, not hurried, just the kind of breathing you hear from someone lying down in bed, settling in. I didn't look back. I walked until the slope leveled out, until the ground under my boots was firmer and the light had begun to fade into evening. But the whole way down, I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see a small figure standing in the doorway, head tilted just enough to watch me go. That night, in my tent miles from that slope, I woke to the sound of rain pattering against the fly. It took me a few seconds to realize there was another sound underneath it, soft, deliberate breathing, close. When I unzipped the flap, there was nothing but darkness and the hiss of the storm. But when I climbed back in, I found something on my sleeping bag. A damp paper crane, the folds still sharp and the fabric beneath it faintly warm. Story 8, The Cabin That Waited for Night. I'd been walking since late morning, following a faint game trail that dipped and climbed along the slope. The forest here was the kind that swallows you after a while. Same trees, same light, no change in the sound of the wind. I'd stopped checking my watch hours ago, moving more by instinct than plan, just trying to find a flat enough patch to set camp before dark. That's when I saw it through the trees, a dull shape at the bottom of a shallow draw. It was a cabin, small, one story, boards greyed with age. The roofline sagged slightly in the middle but held together. From where I stood, it looked abandoned. The windows were clouded and dull, the glass opaque with grime or condensation I couldn't tell from this distance. The door was shut, but something about it stopped me from going closer. The air was still, too still, as if the sound of the wind had been muted in a circle around the building. The shadows on its walls were sharper than they should have been for the hour, as though the sun was already lower here than in the rest of the woods. I took a step toward it, then stopped. The pines around the clearing seemed to lean slightly toward the cabin, not in a natural way, but as if they were bending in to listen. That made me back up without thinking. I told myself it wasn't worth checking out in fading light. I found a small rise maybe 50 yards away and pitched camp. The cabin just visible between the trunks. I figured I'd see what was inside in the morning when the sun was up. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped fast. I cooked a little, ate, and sat in the dim glow of my lantern, the forest pressing in around me. The cabin was just a darker shape in the distance. Then I noticed it. The door was open. I hadn't heard anything, but there it was, a dark rectangle where the wood had been. A yellow glow spilled from inside, the flickering kind you get from firelight. I killed my lantern and sat still. From that distance the light was steady but soft, spilling onto the clearing like a slow pulse. Then came the voices, low, slow, almost a murmur at first, then clearer. The words didn't make sense. Not in English or anything I recognized, long syllables with a rhythm that made my skin crawl. I sat frozen, listening. There was a cadence to it, a rising and falling like something was being recited. Finally, I clicked on my flashlight and aimed it straight at the cabin. The beam cut through the clearing, and in an instant the light inside was gone. The door was closed again, the windows were clouded, dark, exactly as they'd been earlier. No movement, no sound. I stayed awake most of the night, not daring to look that way again. At some point, I must have drifted because when I opened my eyes, it was morning. The air was bright and sharp with frost. I sat up, rubbed my eyes, and froze. My tent was gone. My pack was gone. My stove, lantern, food, even the little ring of stones I'd use for the fire. Gone. I was standing on bare boards. It took me a few seconds to understand that the boards weren't the ground. I was on a porch. The porch of the cabin. The door was in front of me, shut tight, its wood dark with age. Behind me, the forest looked exactly as it had the day before. My camp was nowhere in sight. I don't remember stepping onto that porch. I don't remember leaving my camp. But I remember the cold of the boards under my feet, and the way the shadows on the cabin's walls seemed to shift when I turned my head, just enough to make me think they were waiting for the sun to set again. Story 9. The Drawer That Locked Itself. I'd been out since early morning, working my way along a section of trail that hadn't been marked on any recent maps. It was the kind of job I took now and then, updating records for a conservation group, making notes on overgrowth, trail washouts, old blazes still clinging to bark. The weather was mild but grey, clouds sitting low enough to snag in the tops of the ridges. I'd been making decent progress when I spotted a break in the pines, a narrow cut that looked like it had been cleared decades ago and never touched since. Something in me wanted to follow it. Maybe it was the way the air felt cooler there, or maybe I just wanted to see where it ended. The cut dipped into a small hollow and leveled out, and that's when I saw it. A one-room hunting cabin leaning just slightly, like the ground under it had shifted over time. The siding was dark and weathered, the roof patchy but holding. I'd seen dozens of places like it before, all abandoned long enough for squirrels and damp to take over, but I still stepped onto the porch and pushed the door open. The smell hit me first, rot and dust, the sour tang of old water damage. The interior was bare except for a few collapsed chairs, a table warped into a sag, and in the far corner, a tall dresser. Everything else in the place had surrendered to decay, but the dresser was intact. The wood was scuffed and darkened with age, but the drawers still fit square in their frames. I started from the top, half expecting nothing but dead insects and nests. The first two drawers were empty. The third held a few scraps of folded canvas. But the bottom drawer wouldn't open. It had a small keyhole, and when I pulled at it, it rattled faintly, like something shifting inside with weight to it. Not loose junk, not the random scatter of debris, but something solid, moving against the sides. I crouched and gave it another tug. Same resistance, same rattle. My curiosity was already working on me when I noticed a section of the floorboard beside the dresser that didn't match the rest, slightly narrower, sitting higher than the surrounding boards. I pried at it with the edge of my knife, and it came up easy. Beneath it, wedged in the dark gap between joists, was a small key. The metal was orange with rust, its bow worn smooth. I slid it into the lock. It turned with a reluctant scrape, and the drawer came free with a faint sigh of wood on wood. Inside was a bundle wrapped tight in a child's blanket, small, faded, patterned with little shapes I couldn't make out in the dim light. The edges were frayed, the fabric soft from years of handling. The bundle wasn't heavy, but it had shape to it. I don't know why I hesitated. Maybe it was the stillness of the room, or the way the air seemed thicker all of a sudden. I reached for the corner of the blanket, meaning to see what was inside. But before I could pull it back, the drawer slid in on its own. Not fast, just steady, like a hand was guiding it. When it was flush again, I heard the faint click of the lock engaging. The key was still in the hole. I grabbed it and tried to turn it again, but the metal snapped clean in half, the piece in my hand coming away like it had been waiting for that moment. I stared at the broken end, feeling something between frustration and unease. I stood there for a long moment, listening to the quiet before deciding to leave it. As I stepped toward the door, a faint sound rose behind me, the same soft rattle I'd heard before, coming from the locked drawer. I stopped in the doorway and listened. It came again, a little louder this time, like whatever was inside had shifted. I didn't check it again. I just stepped outside and pulled the door shut behind me, the damp wood pressing into the frame. I marked the location on my map out of habit, but by the time I reached the ridge, I'd decided I wasn't coming back. Even now, when I think about it, I can still hear that last faint rattle, like something inside was waiting for me to give it one more try. Story 10. The footsteps on the roof. By the time I found the cabin, my jacket was soaked clean through, and the rain had settled into that steady, endless kind of fall that seeps into your bones. I'd been following a trail that barely counted as a trail anymore, more a deer path than anything, and I'd long since given up trying to make it back to where I'd planned to camp. The light was going fast. The kind of grey that doesn't turn to black so much as it just folds in on itself, and I knew I needed something, anything, over my head before night fully came. The cabin appeared between the trees without warning, its walls dark from years of weather, roof surprisingly intact. It was nothing more than a single square room. Door hanging by a stubborn hinge, but the floor was dry, and that was enough for me. I shook myself off and laid out my sleeping pad in one corner, my pack serving as a makeshift pillow. The rain drummed on the roof, steady and almost comforting after the long day. I must have been lying there 20 minutes before I heard it, the first footstep overhead. Slow, heavy enough to have weight behind it, but not enough to strain the roof beams. I held my breath and listened. Another step, deliberate, like whoever or whatever it was knew exactly where to place their feet. I told myself it had to be a branch shifting in the wind, maybe a clump of wet leaves sliding down the slope of the roof. The rain could play tricks on your ears in places like this. Then the steps began to move, not randomly, but in a slow, steady circle over my head. I could follow them around the perimeter of the room, each one landing with that same muted thud. My breathing grew shallow, my eyes fixed on the ceiling as if I could see through it. The steps stopped directly above me, the kind of stop that feels intentional. The rain kept falling. My ears strained for the next step, but none came. Instead, from the window to my right came the faint sound of tapping. Light at first, like a single fingertip against the glass, then faster, irregular. I turned my head slowly. Through the sheet of water running down the pane, I saw nothing but the dark smear of the trees outside. No shape, no movement. Then my eyes caught something else, a reflection in the glass, not of the outside but of the inside, of me. And behind me, something darker, less defined, a shape that didn't belong to the pile of my pack or the shadowed wall. I jerked my head around, but the corner behind me was empty, just the same dry boards, the same dim light. When I looked back at the window, the tapping had stopped. The reflection was gone. The rain's rhythm returned to its steady, numbing beat, and for a while I lay there telling myself it had been my own mind, strung tight from the cold and fatigue. But later, just as I felt myself slipping towards sleep, the steps on the roof started again, right where they'd left off. Circling, slow, deliberate. I didn't move, didn't breathe, until they stopped once more above me. This time, the tapping didn't come from the window. It came from directly under the floor. When I finally left in the morning, I didn't look back at the cabin. But the whole way down the trail, I had the uneasy sense that my footsteps weren't the only ones keeping pace. Story 11. The locked room without a door. I was mapping a stretch of forgotten trail in the upper hollows, the kind of place you don't find unless you're already lost or looking for something you probably shouldn't. The air was heavy that day, full of the damp smell of pine and wet soil, and the clouds hung so low over the ridges they felt like they were pressing down on the treetops. I'd been picking my way along a faded game path for an hour when I saw the cabin. It sat in a small clearing, tilted just slightly to one side, its boards dark from years of rain. From the outside, it was nothing special. 2 clouded windows and a single door in the front. The roof was sagging but intact, and the clearing around it was strangely clean. No brush or fallen limbs, as if the forest knew to keep its distance. I stepped up to the door and pushed. It opened without a sound, which I wasn't expecting from a place that looked this old. Inside, the air was still, the kind of stillness that swallows sound. The floor was solid under my boots, the boards dry. A wall split the cabin in half. Floor to ceiling, solid planks, no seams or cracks. On my side, there wasn't much. An old cot, a table half collapsed, and a single chair tipped on its side. On the wall opposite me was another door, set into the divider. It was locked. The wood was old but unbroken. No hinges on my side, no way to see through. I knocked once, half a habit and half curiosity. A few seconds later, something knocked back. It wasn't loud, just one slow, deliberate knock, like the sound had been thought over before it was made. My skin prickled, and I told myself it could have been something shifting inside. Wood settling, maybe. But I didn't try the handle again. I stepped out, pulling the cabin door shut behind me. It wasn't until I was halfway down the trail that I realized my compass was missing. I keep it clipped to my belt, but the carabiner was empty. I thought about leaving it. Truth be told, I didn't want to go back, but it was a good one. And in these woods, losing your bearings can turn bad quick. I turned around. The clearing looked the same as before, the cabin sitting quiet under the grey sky. I went inside, scanning the floor. That's when I noticed the wall was gone. The space was one single room now, open from end to end. The air in here felt colder, sharper. I looked to where the locked door had been, but there was nothing. Just bare boards running unbroken along the wall. In the far corner, my compass lay on the floor. I crossed to it, my boots sounding louder than they should have. I picked it up, and the first thing I noticed was that it wasn't pointing north. The needle was fixed, steady, aimed back toward the open doorway, toward the trail I'd just taken. I don't know how long I stood there, just holding it, feeling that strange stillness pressing in again. When I finally stepped outside, the forest seemed darker, as if the light had drained a little in the time I'd been in there. The needle stayed locked the whole way down the trail, quivering faintly but never swinging back to true north, no matter how far I got. That was weeks ago, and it still hasn't changed. Wherever I am, it points back toward that hollow, toward the cabin. I've thought about going again, just to see, but I'm not sure what I'd find there this time, or if the wall would be waiting for me again. Story 12. The window that looked both ways. I'd been following the main ridge trail most of the afternoon, keeping an easy pace, letting the day stretch out without any real plan for where I'd stop. The weather was holding steady, cool but not cold. The sun filtered through thin clouds, and the trail wound along in that quiet way where you forget you're moving until you glance back and realize you've left miles behind. I might have walked right past it if not for a break in the brush, just wide enough to catch my eye. It was a cabin, small, no bigger than a shed, set back from the trail just far enough to be hidden by the undergrowth. You wouldn't have seen it unless you were looking from the right angle. The boards were weathered silver. Roof slanted but whole, and the brush grew right up to its walls. There was no path leading to it, no old stumps or cuts in the trees to suggest it had been part of anything larger. I stepped inside without much thought, the door hanging loose enough that it opened under its own weight. The air was still, not dusty exactly, but with that faint, dry smell of wood that's been shut up too long. The inside was bare, no furniture, no shelves, no stove. The only thing in the entire space was a square window in the far wall. I crossed to it and looked out, expecting to see the forest behind the cabin. But it wasn't the forest, it was the trail. The same stretch I'd walked earlier, the same dip in the ground where my boots had scuffed through wet leaves. And there, standing in the middle of it, was me, backpack, jacket, the angle of my head exactly as I'd been moving. Frozen mid-step, my first thought was that it had to be some kind of reflection, maybe the glass picking up an image from outside the doorway. But when I glanced over my shoulder, the doorway showed nothing but shadow and brush. I looked back at the window. I was still there, unmoving, the moment suspended like a photograph. I took a step closer to the glass, and my reflection didn't move. My pulse started to rise, and I reached up as if to touch it, but before my fingers could meet the glass, I blinked, and just like that, it was gone. The window showed only the trees now, quiet, green, and still. I stood there longer than I should have, waiting to see if it would change again, but it stayed the same. When I finally left, I told myself it had been a trick of the light, something about the angle of the glass. I stepped back onto the trail and started walking, but every so often, as I moved, I felt the sun shift. The shadows lengthened, crossing the path in front of me in time with my own steps. Not behind me, beside me, and sometimes just ahead, like something was matching my pace, but not quite in the same world. I didn't look back again until I was sure I'd put enough miles between me and that cabin. But even then, when the trail curved and the light changed, I caught the faintest flicker at the corner of my eye, like a square window in the trees, and someone in it standing perfectly still.